Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Logan Ward, and I'm an assistant scientist at Argonne National Lab. And today I'll be talking to you about our efforts at Argonne to build the tools needed to design materials autonomously. As you see in the title of the talk, this is going to focus on how we can build up the techniques needed to orchestrate materials design projects that might require a lot of different types of activities to be performed together to design a material. So before I talk about the details of how we've used autonomous techniques to augment human efforts within materials design, I want to talk first about how this sort of use of AI kind of mirrors the way that these techniques have been used throughout larger parts of society. Because we can see the integration of computation, in particular artificial intelligence technologies like computer vision, going back decades. This article here is from a town not too far from where I grew up in Florida. Details them getting a computer vision system that reads addresses and prints out the zip code where that letter is going to be sent, which dramatically speeds up the rate at which mail can be processed. It allows humans, instead of focusing on time spent labeling and reading handwriting, to other tasks, perhaps other tasks within the mail service or just through society at large. And we can see this trend of artificial intelligence techniques being used more broadly throughout the community, being reflected in more modern technologies. This image here shows the advancements in computer vision within the past 20 or so years, where instead of just reading handwriting, we can take a whole image and classify the different regions of it into different categories. For example, you can see different color shades here indicate whether that part of an image corresponds to, say, a car or a pedestrian or a tree. And those are the kind of techniques that allow us to make machines that can drive cars for us. And of course, this is not only the only use of AI throughout society. Surprisingly, in this image, I couldn't see anyone looking at their smartphone, and there's probably no better illustrator of the advancements of AI as to how they're used in communications. So really the perennial question we have at Argonne, and I'm sure many of you do at TMS do, is how can these kind of techniques be used to augment science? And the way that I look at it in particular is trying to envision what an AI staff scientist may have to do. What are the different tasks and tools and activities that it has to perform in order to execute a materials design process? And this could be, say, interfacing with computing technologies to run simulations of materials, accessing databases, or instrumentation at the APS in order to extract data or generate new data about a material, read the scientific literature, talk to its collaboratories, interface with robotic equipment, and the list goes on. And while we're not going to talk about the solution to building an AI staff scientist today, namely because we're probably not going to have that kind of technology for years, today's talk is going to focus on what are the kind of bits of technology that we're developing that can help make this kind of technology a reality. And in particular, I'm going to focus on two particular areas. The first of which is going to be a deep dive into one particular project that we have for using AI as sort of the guiding tool in developing a particular kind of material. At that point, once I kind of dig through what are all the nuances of building these kind of techniques, I'm going to take a step back and talk about the emerging technologies around Argonne that are going to make this kind of artificial intelligent scientist a reality, and particularly not just make a reality for a scientist at Argonne, but for the research community at large. So, as promised, the first thing that I'm going to talk about today is what we've actually done as a group in order to solve a materials design challenge in one particular area. And that area is the design of molecules for redox flow batteries. So a redox flow battery, if you're unfamiliar, is a kind of battery where we store energy in electrically charged molecules. And the interesting part about a flow battery is that we can separate the parts of the battery system where that energy is stored from the parts of the system that control exchanging it. In short, this is allowing us to decouple the storage of energy and how that is designed from the parts of the battery that are needed to generate a certain amount of power. And this allows us to create a battery system with a large range of costs versus energy versus power, which makes redox flow batteries a particularly interesting tool for long-term storage, because you can make the size of your storage larger by simply buying a larger tank to hold these energetic molecules and filling that with your molecule of choice. Now, where this becomes a materials design challenge is identifying what are those materials that can serve as a energy storage material. And here, this particular problem sounds a lot like many of the other materials design challenges you are likely going to hear about in this symposium or are already familiar with through your own work. Redox flow batteries are a challenge to design because the targets that we're developing them for are gradually being refined. The particular types of chemistry we're searching or the particular design metrics change as technology improves. And actually finding the batteries that optimize those design criteria is particularly difficult because there are billions of potential designs to screen through. So if we're to come up with a tool to be able to design this challenge once, we need to have it be able to run quickly so that once, say, we change some aspect of our design process to rule out a particular kind of battery failure we've observed in the field, or to fit a new niche within the energy storage grid, we don't have to wait more months in order for that battery to come around. And given this need for developing materials at a high speed, we've been considering how to do this on the kind of supercomputers that are about to arrive at Argonne later this year, namely our close to world's first exascale computer called Aurora. We want to be able to use this technique to design molecules very quickly. And another common refrain, if you're from the HPC community, is the fact that once we get these large computers, we get different problems for how to use them. And in particularly, the challenge goes by the fact that even if I'm given a tool that's 100-fold faster than what I've been using before, I am not going to get 100 times smarter in that same time period. So my ability to process data and create ideas to keep that system busy is going to be outstripped by the supercomputer. So that current type of task that we typically use with supercomputers, where me as a scientist sits and considers what I know from the materials community and the results of simulations that I've already completed to come up with those next best tasks to run on the supercomputer, is no longer going to be very tractable. I'm not going to be able to come up with decisions that are good enough, fast enough to keep that supercomputer busy with worthwhile computations. So instead, the way that we're looking about this problem is to make that entire process autonomous, where I can devise a system and an application that runs on that supercomputer that also performs the calculations that are needed to decide which calculations to run. So in short, how can I come up with an artificial computational scientist using a set of intelligent algorithms? And that process of generating new tasks to run on the supercomputer can be broken down into many small problems that we already know how to solve with different kinds of artificial intelligence. That notion of taking what I already know and the new data that I just collected and coming up with ideas for what to test next is a process that's performed by generative models. And these are the kinds of GANs that you may be hearing about in other talks across TMS. There are also supervised learning techniques which take the task of, given these ideas, how do I identify quickly if they're going to work or not, or if I'm very confident about that particular area of materials. Those are supervised learning algorithms. Additionally, the last step in the computational process for me is to decide which ones of these calculations are worth doing. And that process is known as active learning, and it uses techniques like expected improvement to score particular calculations, find the likelihood that they'll improve off of previous materials. And then finally, I execute those tasks, and I repeat the process. And all of this has to occur inside of a large computational workflow. So this is a pretty big wish list, but we've been working on it very diligently over the past few years at Argonne. And I'll talk you through those specific tasks that we had to perform in order to make this a reality, namely the kinds of databases we've built up in order to train a suite of predictive models that can allow us to quickly infer the properties of new electrolytes. And then finally, and this is going to be the part that's more germane to the discussion today, an autonomous application that will perform that screening of new materials without any human input. So given those specific tasks, we'll start off with the first ingredient, what sort of databases we developed. And as illustrated by some of the papers that have come out in the past few years, we built databases of one of the key properties, solvation energy, that includes the solvation energy for about 100,000 atoms, or not atoms, molecules, within 5 different solvents. So a total data set size of about 2/3 of a million. This database couples nicely with the already existing data we have for formation enthalpy, computed at a very high fidelity using advanced kind of hybrid quantum chemistry techniques, G4 and P2. And more recently, we've combined these two data sets with an ability to use them to compute redox potentials, which define how much energy we can store per molecule. And here, besides just calculating them at one level of accuracy, we've created a database where we have the same quantities, ionization potential and electron affinity, calculated at different levels of accuracy, where here I'm showing them compared to G4 and P2, that very high level calculation. And we can do it with, say, different approximations for the energy, whether I say include the 0-point energy with vibrational contributions to the energy, or whether I just calculate the vertical, which is the energy at the same geometry of the neutral. And I can compute these geometries using different levels, or compute the energy given that geometry using different levels of accuracy. And that gives me, in short, a 100-fold trade-off between the amount of computation I'll expend and about a factor of 2 difference in what levels of accuracy that will give me. And as you'll see later, that can allow us to speed up our design processes by exploiting those variances. Our next step were to build up a suite of predictive models, and I'll talk about just one of them for today. We built up a model that predicts the solvation energy given only the molecular structure. So here we use message passing networks, which are a very common kind of deep learning model, which works like this. I first take my molecule and I break it down into atoms and bonds that I can enumerate based on their types. I then assign them an initial set of features, which is a process called embedding, that I then update for each atom based on which bonds it's connected to and what the type of the other atom on that end of the bond is. I use those information about the neighbors to create messages. I use the messages to update the property of that atom, and then I repeat the process. I now have atoms that have features that reflect the properties of their neighbors. I then update that property again, and I repeat this several times until I get a feature for each atom that describes its local environment. I then augment these with the properties of the solvent, namely the dielectric constant, and I pass those through a network that predicts a single value for each atom, its contribution to the solvation energy, which I can sum up to predict the solvation energy for the whole molecule. And as shown on the right, this model, which combines both properties of the solute and the solvent, gives me a model that can accurately predict the properties or the solvation energy of a molecule in solvents we haven't yet explored. So in this way, we don't have to train a new model if we decide we want to design for a battery with a different solvent. Another thing I'll point out about this work is that we went through a great effort to ensure that this network would actually function on the molecules we're interested in testing. So what we did was we trained our model first on a set of small molecules from that database I mentioned a few slides ago. I then measured the accuracy on a test set produced from that data set, and then a set of molecules that I created that were larger. And I found that for our first iteration, a technique that instead of computing atomic contributions to the solvation energy, computed it for the entire molecule at once. And this we found had disastrous errors for those large molecules. Instead, we ended up selecting an atomic contribution model, the kind I just walked you through, which performs markedly worse on that initial data set, but performs much better on our target search space. So this here is just a little example to show you that when you create these models, you need to pay great attention to how they are meant to be used and validate them accordingly. Beyond these message passing networks, which as shown in the figure on the right, we can use to also predict the ionization potential of molecules, we've gone up and built a larger suite of techniques. For example, we have these delta learning models which take in the property we're trying to predict at a low level of fidelity, such as if we were trying to predict the ionization potential as shown here, computed with a very large basis set, using only the ionization potential computed with a small one, 321G. By using this delta learning model, coupled with a Schnedt architecture that takes in the 3D geometry to predict a correction factor, we can improve off the accuracy of our molecular structure alone model. Here you can see we reduce it by about 10%. Moving forward, if we computed an even more accurate measurement, say instead of computing the vertical, I compute the neutral geometry and use that to compute an adiabatic ionization potential, I can improve the prediction of my high fidelity calculation by a factor of 2. So what this is showing here is how we have a suite of models which allow us to predict the properties of molecules given a variety of information we might have about it, be it only the molecular structure or the molecular geometry and a property computed at a low level of fidelity. And the more information, the better that prediction gets. So given these two ingredients, a set of data sets and models that we can train on them, our next task was to build an agent that could go off and gather new data, testing new molecules without our effort. And this is actually a non-trivial process. Even if we've got tools that can, say, train a model easily or run simulations to gather new data, figuring out how to loop them together requires some thought. To illustrate this, imagine if you're using a very big supercomputer, and as is the case for many simulations, I can't run a single molecule on the entire system. So I have to run a series of simulations on different molecules in parallel. I could either decide to run a batch of them and wait for the entire batch to complete, which has problems of underutilization, or I could generate a new simulation each time any previous one completes, which has a better utilization at the cost of using less information to pick what simulation to run next. Now, expressing these policies becomes a challenge, because you can imagine that these are not the only two we could come up with. I could say, what if I retrained my model not very frequently? I only did it when I found I've drifted to a part of molecular space that I'm not very good at predicting. So in order to build up these complex policies, we've created a software system called Colmena, which I talk about in a presentation you can find on YouTube. The presentations from the Supercomputing 21 conference a few months ago, where we break down these complex policies into a series of simple actions like perform a simulation or retrain a machine learning model that are guided by a set of computational agents that determine when to run them and on what inputs. And these individual agents are very simple. I have one whose entire task is read the next molecule from a simulation queue and submit it when resources are available. Then I have another one that perhaps takes the set of most recent simulations and uses TensorFlow to update the model, and another that takes the results of inference and uses them to update a queue of molecules to perform, and then updates the list of simulations that are pulled from that first agent. And in this way, I can have a very intelligent policy, something that can be designed to use resources very effectively, but expressed using a very simple set of workflow tools. So again, I'm not going to talk about the Python toolkit that this is built on, as it's not as germane to TMS as it was to SC21, but I've made that presentation available, and you can also find the paper in the conference proceedings. And what this tool allows us to do is run very large-scale simulations and use our resources very intelligently. You can see that in this run trace of how we use 1024 nodes on our Theta supercomputer over the course of 6 hours, how we use them for different tasks. The color of the node is what it was being used for. So red are inference tasks, and the shade is how many of them we were actually using. So at the beginning you can see I dedicated all of my nodes to inference, and I used about a third of them to finish evaluating all of my possible molecules in about 5 or 6 minutes. I then dedicated all 1,000 nodes to simulation, and then periodically retrained my model given those outputs of simulations, used those updated models to rerun inference, and then once that was completed, went back to running only simulation for a short time. And this complex application actually allowed us to find molecules very efficiently. This chart here is showing the outcome of the number of molecules we found with a very high ionization potential as a function of time during a smaller scale simulation on over 6 hours. I showed 3 different versions of the application. In gold, I show you the most intelligent version of the application with all of that model retraining built in. In red, I take away the model retraining, and in blue, I take away the machine learning altogether. And you can see that in the case of no machine learning, I don't find any of these good molecules after 5 hours, and I terminate the system. But for my retraining molecule, I find about 100. And for my molecule design engine that retrains its models intelligently, I find about 10% more, all using the same size of allocation and, as I'll emphasize, all without any human intervention. So moving forward, we're making this intelligent application even more independent. We're coming up with ways for running multiple types of tasks concurrently so that we can perhaps optimize solvation energy and ionization potential concurrently. And as you can see in this Pareto plot, I can find a trade-off between molecules that are very soluble, that I can pack a lot into my fuel, but where each molecule doesn't store very much energy, and I can find something on the other end of the pole. And if this is the kind of science that you're finding is a challenge that you need to solve, I actually encourage you to read a paper from some of my colleagues at Argonne who have illustrated how to solve this multi-objective using Bayesian optimization. Additionally, we're also building in tools that allow us to pick not which property we run, but also what level of accuracy we run. And this can provide the ability to accelerate even further. This trace is showing for 2 different applications, one that could only pick 1 level of fidelity, and a second that could pick 2. And you can see that in this benchmark problem, I'll note I made the second level of fidelity, the high accuracy one, twice as slow as the low level. We find more molecules per unit amount of simulation time expended. And if this is a problem that sounds like something that you're working with, I encourage you to read the paper from one of my colleagues at Brookhaven that discusses the kind of mathematical algorithms you can use to help pick different levels of accuracy. And those are going to be the kind that we're going to use in our next version of the application. So at this point, I've talked you through a deep dive on one of the applications we've used, where we found molecules that are good for redox flow batteries using an autonomous HPC application. In order to make that work, we spent a lot of time developing data sets and created a suite of different machine learning models, where each model can predict a different property using a different amount of information about the molecule. For example, either just the molecular graph or the molecular graph plus information about our estimates for that property at a low level of fidelity. Using these data sets and machine learning models, we've created an autonomous tool that can use thousands of HPC nodes all together in order to find molecules. And we found that in order to make that happen, we needed to actually test our machine learning models on those molecules we were going to explore, and that if we do it all together and build this autonomous agent, we can start to see improvements in about 10% over just a machine learning model that's trained once and used to order materials only that one time. If we train that model again online as we perform the simulations, we can achieve more performance even with the same amount, with no additional resources added. So at this point, I'm going to briefly sketch through some of the techniques we're building up at Argonne to more fully realize this idea of an AI staff scientist that can do more than just run HPC tasks. It could perhaps use open data sets or interact with robots. And here we're going to touch on various projects without going into them in much depth. So roughly going counterclockwise through these lists, we'll talk first about the tools we're building up in collaboration with friends at the University of Chicago to tie together the kind of databases that are available through the materials community using the materials data facility, which allows us to access data published in many different resources through a uniform interface. We've coupled this with the tool we've been building at Argonne that provides a similar kind of capability for computational tools, where I could say publish a machine learning model that can then be run remotely through the cloud without that user having to install any of the required software packages. Putting them together in Foundry, we create the ability to say pull down data and run a machine learning model on it, all through a very simple interface. And this is the kind of tool that we can use to build up larger machine learning workflows. And just to reference how this is being used, the data that I've mentioned earlier and the machine learning models that go along with them are both available through the Materials Data Facility, DL Hub, and our newer tool, Foundry. We've also been building up the kind of compute and software infrastructure needed to run larger types of analysis pipelines, such as those used in our crystallography beam lines at APS. So here we build up a set of tools that automate the user experience of going between having data being captured and having that data be available to others. And what it will do is automate the processes of moving that data to archival storage. Once that data is available on that archive, executing the kinds of computations that are needed to perhaps reconstruct that protein structure, and then registering that structure with a data portal so that others can go and find it. And this is the kind of capability we built up at first to solve some of the problems our laboratory was having on being able to rebuild the protein structures of the COVID-19 virus. And as illustrated by Darren, one of our senior beamline scientists, reduce the time needed to build those protein structures from weeks down to hours. And that is all taken, most of those gains are by removing humans from the process and simply automating the whole thing. Additionally, we're building up tools that allow AI to make use of information provided in scientific articles. And one little vignette from that community effort is work done by 3 of the graduate students I work with at the University of Chicago, Ashuthi Ajith, Ji Hong, and Greg Polowski, whose images are down on the bottom left. What they've been working on is a tool that allows us to build machine learning models that pull data out of scientific papers with much less human effort needed to label first where the different properties of interest are. And the way that this works is actually very simple. We train a gigantic machine learning model, one with 1 billion parameters, on sets of hundreds of thousands of scientific papers. And by building up the size of this data set and training it on papers from the scientific literature, we can identify the categories of many different scientific terms without any additional labeling effort. If I simply feed words from the biochemistry data sets, or chemistry like ChemDNR, into this database or into this model and see how it categorizes them, we can see that it separates them very far together. And this is again without any human labeling. It can find that biomedical terms and chemistry terms are indeed different. And it does this much better than models of similar size, this BERT large, that was trained on general literature like newspaper articles or Wikipedia pages. And this is all done without any human labeling and gives us a great starting point for, say, solving a task like identify the polymers within these papers and then associate them with their glass transition temperatures. The work that they're doing here is a major step forward into making those technologies faster and therefore easier for many other labs to use. Additionally, Argonne's also been investing a lot of staff time into building up the tools needed to create autonomous user facilities, where the concept here is we can break up large scientific challenges into simple sets of stations that allow for performing different kinds of scientific analyses, and robots that are programmed to perform different skills, such as going to a titration station and adjusting or determining the pH of a solid or of a liquid, or taking that now titrated liquid and performing cyclic photometry on it. The idea behind all of these is that by breaking down these processes into repurposable chunks, we can quickly build up workflows for many different kinds of materials challenges. And all of these are being built on top of the kind of technologies that we've already mastered as a laboratory. For example, mastered is perhaps a strong term for the kinds of scientific automation tools we're building up with Colmena, or the kind of automation platforms we're building with Globus Flows. More recently, we've been coupling these with infrastructure that allows for hooking in robots to these data platforms, namely through the Argonne Discovery Cloud, and in such a way can really move forward towards building up design software that can leverage both the compute, characterization tools, and synthesis capabilities at Argonne. So at this point, I'd like to wrap up our talk with emphasizing that our two different areas we discussed were a particular example of how we can build up autonomous agents that design materials on HPC using a simple set of computational tools, and how we're building up the capabilities needed to do this kind of autonomous design in the real world using actual bench equipment and advanced user facilities like the APS. So at this point, I'd also like to reference some of the work I've been doing outside of my purely scientific efforts in building up tools for educating others about how to use AI in material science, partly through a course run at UChicago as part of a larger tutorial series with others at Argonne, and at upcoming talks at the spring MRS meeting, where we're going to talk about tools for battery data science. I'd also like to thank the very large team that I'm very happy to be a part of that has really made these large efforts possible, as well as funding from our various resources. I also look forward to any future discussions on these subjects, and regret that I won't be able to discuss them with you synchronously, but hopefully you'll be able to get in contact with me through the virtual sessions of TMS.